Hi, I'm going to be doing my book talk on Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria by Beverly Daniel Tatum. The first thing I wanted to talk about was the overall feeling that the book gave me. The first thing I noticed was how passionate Dr. Tatum is about this topic, and that really made it more enjoyable for me, and also it really helped me just learn more, because when someone is super passionate in something, it helps you to also be passionate in it. The other thing that really stood out to me was just after finishing the book was how I felt way more in touch with my own identity, which is not something that I expected to feel. I don't think white identity was something that I'd ever really talked about, and I'm going to talk about that later. Also, the model minority idea really stood out to me because I have a lot of friends who are Asian, and my stepdad is actually Asian, and I had never really thought about how they are treated. They have more expectations are put on them than other people of color and white people. So for the sake of time, I'm going to move on a little bit from that. And the first of the 5 tenets that I'm going to talk about, the first one I wanted to talk about was the early years, because that's a pretty big portion of the book, and obviously very relevant to our class. So the first thing, again, I had no idea how early children think about race. The book says that they think they have race-related memories as early as 3 years old sometimes, and that's on page 111. And there's a quote on page 112 that I wanted to go ahead and read. And it's about how children who have these race-related experiences, how if they don't talk about it, what can happen. If they didn't talk to anyone else about it, how did these 3 or 5 or 8 or 13-year-old children make sense of their experience? Has the confusion continued into adulthood? Are we as adults prepared to help the children we care about make sense of their own race-related observations? Those questions all really stood out to me because I'm going into social work, and I need to be prepared to work with people of color and help them make sense of their own race-related observations. Also, if I have children, even if those children are white or mixed, I need to help them make sense of their own race-related observations, because children have race-related observations, and if they aren't talked about, then they'll never understand or realize that people who are different from them they have their own experiences that you need to help, that you need to try to understand, and that you can still be friends with them, and you can have a lot of things in common and you can learn a lot from them. The other thing that was in the early years chapter that I really wanted to talk about was different ways that you can give children ways to see themselves in media, or learn about race-related issues through media. So in the book, she talks about giving children picture books that talk about race-related issues and the history of racism in our country, and also books that don't just paint white people as victimizers and don't just paint black people as victims. And I thought that was really, really important, because I do think that racism can be very confusing to little children, and there can be a lot of just guilt for white people when you learn about it, and I think it's important to see both sides of it, although there definitely were victimizers, obviously, in our history, which is also important to understand. All right, so the next thing I wanted to talk about was the development of white identity, and that's something that I talked about a little bit when I was just talking about the things that stood out to me, but I want to talk about it a little bit more. So obviously this stood out to me because I'm white, so I really paid special attention to this. Also, I had never thought about how my whiteness impacts my identity. That was not something that I'd ever talked about or thought about, and it's because I have the privilege of having experiences outside of my whiteness and being able to have an individual identity outside of my whiteness, and I recognize that. But it also was very, very interesting to see, the importance of white identity and being able to see yourself, see your identity in the context of your whiteness. So there was a quote on page 186 through 187 that I wanted to talk about. While the task for people of color is to resist negative societal messages and develop an empowered sense of self in the face of a racist society, Helms says the task for whites is to develop a positive white identity based in reality, not on assumed superiority. In order to do that, each person must become aware of his or her whiteness, recognize that it is personally and socially significant, and learn to feel good about it, not in the sense of a Klan member's white pride, but in the context of a commitment to a just society. Yeah, I just thought that quote was so amazing and really summed up what white people need to work on and what white identity should be. So, and that also really plays into what I was saying before about picture books and letting children understand what white identity is outside of assumed superiority or anything that they might have learned from their peers or things growing up. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is using white identity to combat racism. So firstly, the book really emphasized that racism is real and it's still happening, and that there's a huge discrepancy in wealth between white people and people of color. And there was a quote on page 212 that I want to go ahead and read about that. Only 3% of executives, senior level officials, and managers in the U.S. are Black. Only 4% of doctors and 5% of attorneys are Black. Additionally, a 2016 analysis of federal government data by the Pew Research Center finds that Blacks are, on average, at least twice as likely as whites to be poor or to be unemployed. In 2014, the median white household income was $71,300, while the median Black household income was $43,300. So, I really think the numbers speak for themselves. Anyone who argues that racism is not real anymore needs to just read that quote and see that racial inequality is so present in our society. And like I said, going into be a social worker and being a white person with white privilege, I need to fight to give minorities the resources that they need. Also, just fight on a macro level to help combat this racial inequality that is so present in our society. Also, the idea of affirmative action. I knew what affirmative action was, and I thought that it was great, and it is great, but I didn't realize how easy it was for companies to still discriminate, even though they're supposed to be participating in affirmative action. And there's a quote on page 217 that I'd like to read. Well, I'm not going to read the whole quote because it's kind of long and I'm running out of time, but the quote basically is talking about how there was a study where they sent in resumes with people whose names sounded Black and people whose names sounded more European or white, and white names received 50% more callbacks for interviews. Again, racism is so present in our society, and that's really important to understand as a white person, because you don't see it, you don't experience it. So to be able to combat it, you need to understand that it is real. So that's the main thing that I wanted to talk about for using white identity to combat racism, because it's knowing that it's real and knowing the statistics it's just the first step to being able to combat it. So it's really important. So the next thing I want to talk about is the importance of cross-racial dialogue, but also the importance of interracial dialogue. So a lot of people can be very afraid to talk about race with other people outside of their race. So white people can be afraid because they don't want to say the wrong thing. They don't want to act like, they don't want to assume they know. And then Black or people of color, Black people or people of color are sometimes afraid to speak out about it because it can be very scary to talk about things that you experience every single day. And, especially when you don't know how people are going to react. So having interracial dialogue can be really important because it can break down those barriers and you can just speak freely. But also having a cross-racial dialogue is super important because you can understand that other people, you can make friends with people outside of your race who have similar opinions about race as you, and you can have candid and open conversations about race, which I think a lot of times doesn't happen in our society, and it should happen more. And there's a quote on page 332 that I wanted to read. All right. And this is about the fear of white people. Yes, there is fear, one white woman wrote. The fear of speaking is overwhelming. I do not feel for me that it is a fear of rejection from people of my race, but anger and disdain from people of color, the ones who I am fighting for. In my response to this woman's comment, so this is her response to what the woman said, I explained that she needs to fight for herself, not for people of color. After all, she's been damaged by the cycle of racism too, though perhaps that this is less obvious. That really stood out to me, and it really helped me realize that even if you're afraid, you need to speak out, because it's affecting you and it's affecting people worse than it's affecting you, so you need to speak out about it. All right, the last of the 5 tenets that I want to talk about was how in the epilogue she talked about signs of hope. This book for me was very, it incited a lot of anger in me, and I wanted to, as a white person, help make change and listen to Black people and do the right thing, which is super important. But it's also important to see that there have been some good things going on. So the book gave many examples of steps in the right direction towards racial equality and understanding. So on page 344, she talked about how there was an incident of someone yelling racial slurs at a Black student who was visiting the school, and how the student body president came out and made a statement about it and really used his platform to talk about racial inequality. And I think that's something that could really happen here at Belmont, because I've heard of unjust things happening, like people yelling racial slurs at the Black people at our school because our school is majority white. And I think that more things need to be said about that. Also, the Atlanta Friendship Initiative, that really goes back to the cross-racial dialogue idea. It's so important to have those friendships outside of your race so you can have a deeper understanding of what they experience, even if you'll never experience it yourself. And also just being able to talk about different political beliefs and things. It's super important. And finally, the epilogue inspired me to do more in my community and with friends/family to create opportunities to invite diversity and conversations about race. So that was what the epilogue mainly did for me. And it, like I said, it's really been inciting a lot of just like fiery passion in me about this. And I'm very excited to do something about it when I become a social worker and now. Sorry. And how will this book shape the way I think about families and communities? Well, it really emphasized my idea of cultural humility, meaning I'll never understand this, but it's something that I can work every day to be able to combat. And it also emphasized the individual, like not every minority has experienced the same things or views their identity the same way. And that's super important as a social worker to understand that just because you've worked with 20 people of color in your career doesn't mean that you understand how people of color work. I mean, how they experience their life. I don't know why I said how they work. And also that every single person has a different experience. Also, just ignoring racial differences puts a strain on relationships. I need to learn to be comfortable with conversations on a community level so that I can be the change I want to see in the world. That was the main thing I took from this book, that I need to be the one to start conversations. Now, I'm officially over time, so I'm going to end it there, but thank you so much for listening, and I really recommend this book. I think it's amazing.